Hello, everyone. Welcome to How to Low Code for Developers. My name is Amanda, like you just heard, developer advocate at Wix. If you saw Eddie's awesome talk this morning, I do support the Eddie Hub community, so you might see me in the open source community there, helping out with the BioDrop repo, which I hope you're all going to check out later. So before I kind of dive into what we're really going to talk about, I have a personal connection to low code, and it's a reminder to me as I go through my journey as a developer to always check myself when I feel a stereotype or a stigma come on about a particular type of tool, especially when the conversation around that tool is how to get rid of or have less developers, similar to what's going on with AI right now. So for me, that journey began well before I worked for Wix. It began when I was offered a job as a developer and had no formal training as a developer. I worked next to a dev team, helped them with some things, maybe had written a few lines of JavaScript here and there, a Python script to automate something that I was working on, but would have never even thought about calling myself a developer. And was given an opportunity to join this team because I had some knowledge and had worked with them, and they just believed in me, and it was an incredible opportunity. So when I started on this team, it was a government contractor. And they mostly had all kinds of stacks they would work with across different clients, different contracts. But their bread and butter was kind of C#.NET projects, and a lot of CMS style, your traditional low code, your WordPress, your Drupal, your Joomla. And those were their two kind of like main stacks that always came through a lot of their clients again and again. And this is where the stigma started. So I'm new. I almost don't even know if I should be here. I'm completely comprised of imposter syndrome at this point, and just looking to these senior developers for any nuance to like, how can I be like these people here? How can I prove to them that they're taking a chance on the right person? And what I learned very quickly is that the CMS sites, the low-code sites, nobody wants to work on them. These are something that is like a pain. They have to work on them. They're a mess. They're not for the developers. And some of this was overt complaints about these projects, and some of it was more subtle. But I'm a sponge at this point. I'm picking up on every little subtlety that the senior developers talk about, that they think and how they act, because I don't have opinions of my own yet. I'm still not a developer yet. I also know that I'm allowed into those projects right away. I'm allowed to like mess around and fail in these projects. I'm not allowed to touch the C# projects yet. Those ones require me to do some training to learn about the system. So I'm getting the idea that there's a difference in dev right from my very first experience. So that stigma and that stereotype stayed with me even as I evolved, as I got better, as I learned more, as I felt my imposter syndrome grow smaller and smaller. It's still with me, maybe like a little shoulder friend at times, but not my full existence now. And where it really kind of came to a head for me, and I took a step back in the way that I thought about these kinds of projects, was when I was given just a lead on a small CMS project that we had because it was an existing client. They had a terrible Joomla site. If you've never touched Joomla before, I don't know if it was the fault of Joomla or the fault of all the developers that came before me, leaving a graveyard of mess. But it wasn't a fun site to work on. And the client didn't like it either, but they wouldn't give us funding to make it better or get rid of it and replace it with something else. So they came to us with a need for an event, and they said, we don't have a lot of money. We don't have a lot of time. This is very common in contracting. We just need you to make something for us for this event that we have coming up. From a logic perspective, the only thing I really needed to do was hook up an API for them and create like a leaderboard. It was for a green commuting initiative for different companies to compete on in their locality. And they didn't want me to use their site, but that's all they had. And so they're back and forth. They're like, we want it modern. We want it to look cool. We don't want it to look like our site. But I'm not a designer. I'm not an artist, and they weren't willing to pay for a designer. So we're trying to pull out of them, what do you actually want? Just let us hook this up. And eventually, we kind of gave up. Me and my project manager exhausted through many meetings with this client, like trying to figure out, just like give us something that we can actually work on, a wireframe, literally anything useful other than buzzwords. And they couldn't do it. They just could not function. And so on a Friday, I'm like, you know what? I'm just going to build them something. I'm not a designer, I don't know what to do, I'm just gonna build something and then hopefully they can iterate. Hopefully they can look at it and say, oh, move this thing, change this thing. Maybe that's a better place to start with this client. So I work all weekend trying to make something I think is modern and cool. I don't know how to make things modern and cool, I'm not an artist again. But we get there on Monday morning to show them this and hopefully move on because the deadline's swift approaching and it cannot move, it's an actual event. And they come into this meeting with us and they're like, we solved it. We built something over the weekend, and I'm terrified now that this client who can't even function to tell me what they want has gone and built something over the weekend. What they did was build a Wix site. And at the time, this is where my stigma came right back, and this time about Wix. And I was like, oh no, in the back of my head. I'm client facing right now. I've got a very flat face on when they're telling me what they built. And of course, they get to a point where they go, we love it, this is exactly what we wanted, and we built it ourselves. And now, just hook up this API for us and make that the live leaderboard we wanted. And in the back of my mind, I went, oh my God, you can't. Like, that's not even a low-code platform. That is a no-code platform, and you all should have asked me first, and now we're wasting everybody's time again. But of course, it's a client. I said, let me look into that for you. And then we signed off, and I was like, well, maybe there's like a way to shove an iframe in there or something. I was like, maybe there's something. And so I open up the platform that they gave me access to, thinking that they just created a whole lot more work for me, and I'm probably gonna have to disappoint this client again, and I have no time, and I hate this project, and I wanna do more interesting work. And this is the first year that Wix expanded into developer tooling. And at that time, it was just this little teeny tiny thing. It was a dev mode, you turned it on, there was a few APIs. But I saw in that moment, I was like, oh, I can write JavaScript in here. Yeah, I can actually do what they want. And in that moment, I realized I let my stereotypes about low code and my stigma get in the way that I wasn't even keeping up with the landscape of these tools and how they were changing. And that my client had to stumble across it and then come bring it to us. And they didn't have a technical background to even assess if it was going to work, and they spent their time building on it. If it had been 6 months or a year earlier, I would have had to go right back to them and say, no, this isn't a tool we can use. And it made me think about the fact that even though low-code tools may not be geared towards developers in a large way, they're geared towards a lot of different kinds of professions that might need to be in that space with you, that we're really the ones that should be assessing them for their capacity, for where does the walled garden start and end? What can you do? And then being able to bring it to different clients where it's appropriate. We would have saved so much time if I had known what was going on in the landscape of these tools. It's also really interesting because then I ended up working at Wix a few years later, and they've come a long way since then. So that's kind of like where my personal ties to thinking about low-code platforms is. So today, what I want to talk about is, of course, going back to what's this definition of low code? What does it even mean? Because it's kind of fuzzy at this point, especially when you look at like kind of the landscape of how things have evolved. And then if we take and center the developer in the conversation, then what does it look like in practice? What does it look like to have a workflow around low code that starts with the developer deciding when and how to use the tools? And then we'll wrap up with a few takeaways. So first, what is low code? We tend to think of low code, of course, as your WYSIWYG platforms. There's always like a visual component. There's something you drag on. There's something that's all settings based and various levels of how much code you can actually write around it. With AI-generated code, AI-generated UI, I'm sure we've all seen what came out with Vercel recently. It's really incredible, but is that now part of this landscape? Is that now low code? The code is being generated in some cases and used as is, or is it not because we can see the code? So where does it end? It's a similar conversation though. Then this is a little bit spicier. Don't worry, I don't believe these to be part of the low code landscape. But what I think about when I look at this is when I npm install something, I'm saying, I don't want to build that from scratch. I want to use this library, this thing that somebody else made that I'm trusting is a good choice because I want to spend my time somewhere else. Our frameworks are abstracting things away for us. Excel, you can write Python in now. So is that a low-code tool now? Just thinking about the fact that when developers choose the right tools, the right stacks, the right things for any project, we're always assessing trade-offs. And there's different kinds of trade-offs for the different tools we use. when you look up low code and you kind of go back, like, where did this all start? Where did we start to feel like these tools weren't for us? It kind of always comes back to this time in 2014, which is very old at this point, especially in the tech world, where we had this like low codes are for enabling rapid business development, minimal hand coding, so get rid of developers. And it was never about us. There was never a focus on developer experience. There was never a focus on keeping us around. It was you don't have to have an expensive dev team anymore to stand up a site. We don't need them. I don't know about you, if you've had to use low-code platforms, like they always end up with you. There's always something that somebody runs into and they're like, oh my God, find the developer, see if they can work around this problem that I've found in this platform that somebody else chose without a developer potentially even in the room. And that just put us into two camps. It put us into those who write code and those who don't, or maybe can dabble a little bit. And that just was never the case of how it actually worked out in the end once these platforms came into practice. What it really is, in my opinion, is a spectrum, and that always starts from the least amount of developer involvement to the most amount of developer involvement. So even no code or very minimal code platforms, I find that when somebody runs into a problem, they still go find the developer, help me figure out what this is, help me figure out how we can work around this limitation. We're always there guiding, no matter how much we're actually touching the platform once it's been implemented. So in my opinion is that understanding how and when to use low code can and should always fall in the hands of the developer. The way that we think and analyze and decide on what tools to use is the value provided there, and also you might end up having to use it, so shouldn't you be able to have an opinion on when and how it gets used? So if we say that the developers should be using these tools and choosing them or guiding and advising business leaders on which tools to use, how do we do that? The role of the developer then becomes similar to the role of the developer in anything else. You are guiding the architecture. The biggest point in low code, though, is assessing the trade-offs. Are the trade-offs good for the problem that you're trying to solve? What's the risk if you go this way? Is the velocity that you're getting worth the risk of the trade-off of whatever the platform has there? And the trade-offs are real, but developers are the best ones to assess what those trade-offs really are, because we understand under the hood how these things are built. Even if you can't necessarily get to the code, you know there's code underneath of there and you understand it. Then once a platform is chosen, you're also the right person to then create guardrails. There's an idea that I see a lot that you can't break something if it's drag and drop, or you can't make a big mess and you can't screw things up, but you can, and it depends on the freedom within the platform. And so as a developer, you need to be able to assess the security. What's the deployment strategy? Can you test? When somebody drags elements onto something, you're not running a test as like when you would run against your code. Is there any way to test things? Is there any way to make sure that when changes are in, can you block the wrong people from screwing things up in production? Is there version control? And then finally is analyzing those outcomes. Were the trade-offs eventually worth it? Is this platform valuable for us? Then the other part that is good for the developer to understand, or good for all of us to understand, is that when. Low-code platforms aren't great for everything. That's definitely not ever going to be an argument that I would make. But for me, I found these 4 points are when it really works well. And in contract work, like my first job, agency and freelancing, so anything I've ever done on the side, a lot of times it's small businesses, and it's nice to be able to move quickly and not spend all of my free time coding. You'll notice the first 3 there are really about like a client dev or a client team relationship. You're probably handing off the project almost completely or completely at some point. They don't want to rely on you for updates for things. They want to know that they can function on their own once the product is stood up. The other time that I found it really useful is when I worked on my second dev job, that I worked on a more like a multidisciplinary team that really needed to move quickly and be in the same platform. So you had the designer working in this case it was Elementor in WordPress, and so they could design right in the environment. The marketing team was able to go in and set up their funnels with no problem without me. The copywriters and copy editors could go in and do that. They could stand up all of their things they were doing, do their A/B testing. They didn't need to bother us a whole lot, so that we could work more on our internal tools and the things that supported the front-facing websites which at that agency were a lot of WordPress websites. And it worked really well. We were able to be in the same environment without a lot of handing off to different people. They could move independently without the dev team for a lot of the regular tasks they needed to do. And it worked really well. So I'm going to just walk you through a case study that's kind of a similar, so I'm not used to having sound next to me. It's a similar kind of flow that I've run into a lot over the course of my dev career. So we're just going to take a restaurant client. Restaurants are simple, right? They're fairly straightforward. The websites don't need to do a whole lot. They tend to need to do the same thing. They need to show you that they have a restaurant, show you where it is, allow you to book a reservation, and maybe give you some other information, but they're pretty much the same thing. Anytime you have a project that it's like a reinventing the wheel to make it from scratch, that's potentially a good place for low code. So the first you would want to do is gather the requirements, of course, like anything. Now, you might not be the one gathering the requirements. In a relationship like this, where you have a client and a freelancer, you might be obviously gathering your own requirements, unless you're working with a team. But you might, if you're on a dev team, have a product manager doing that. But at some point, you're going to get requirements. In this case, it's limited budget. There's a focus on opening the restaurant itself. It, again, needs only a menu and booking to start. And this is something that I think is important for especially low-code platform assessment. Find out if there's a future plan. A lot of, especially businesses, entrepreneurs, startups, anybody, like these are creative people. They probably have a down-the-line plan that they're thinking about. And you want to know if the platform you're assessing can potentially handle the future, because you don't want to build something now and have to migrate away from it in a year. That's not ideal. They have one custom request. They want a place for employees to be able to enter the data around their holidays, around their open and close times. They want all of that. They don't want that to have to be done automatically. They want to be able to have it done dynamically once it's set up. So then you would have to go into choosing your tools. Now, there's lots of tools out there that you would assess. Like I said at the beginning, I work for Wix. I'm going to use Wix as the example here, but any of the things that I'm saying right now can apply to any tool that you're assessing. So you would prioritize your needs and wants. Evaluate cost also kind of depends on what project it is. It might not be cost in money. It might be cost in your dev time. Is it in a language that I use? Is it a proprietary to that platform language? What is the cost of my time to even be able to work in this environment if it's not something you're already used to? And then you're going to also evaluate the resources just like you would with anything else. What is the documentation like? Is there content around it? Can I learn this? Are there tutorials? Is there content? And is there a community and any kind of support that I have access to if I inevitably run into a problem, a question, or am I yelling into the void? So then what's the workflow look like? Documentation, we don't just run to build things, right? We look at the documentation first, sometimes. Well, at some point you'll get to the documentation. So for Wix, you would land on our documentation and you would see we have many developer offerings, headless, app devs, website devs. For a restaurant client, like I said, you're likely not going to do a headless site in this kind of client that has a limited budget because that's more work on you. They want to handle the design themselves. You're going to just do a website. But you can say, what does this platform offer if I ever need to consider it again? So we would be looking through the custom website APIs. Now, from going through the documentation, what you will find, and this is common in a lot of low-code platforms too, parts of it are more flexible than others. So less flexible is the restaurant part of Wix. It's a no-code app. You can drag it on, and it has all the pages that you would need to set up to be able to do your bookings, your menu, all of that on your site. But there isn't an API that allows you to extend the restaurant app. So this is something important to know with the client you're working at. They need to now assess that this is okay, that they don't need anything special, that the out-of-the-box app works because you don't want to find out later that they had a special need for their restaurant and now you have to rebuild. But what's highly flexible are some of the things they want for the future. E-commerce is highly flexible, has a full suite of APIs able to extend it in any way that you want. Bookings for when they want to do cooking classes, full set of APIs, and same with the data APIs, the CMS capabilities. So now you can easily go back to that client and say, here are the restrictive areas of this, here are the flexible areas. Should we still move forward? What you're going to look for as a developer then is get to the community and support, of course. When you have a question, are you yelling into the void? As a developer advocate, I'm very involved in the community. We have a Discord community and a forum, and there's product teams are in there, and developer advocates, and different kind of sessions and things that you might be able to learn from. There's content created, and there's a very supportive and active community. So that's a great thing to see, because you're probably going to run into something that you don't understand at some point in your journey. So then the fun part, unless you started here because you just wanted to build something, which I completely understand, is the dev environment. What language do I need to know? What's the environment? Where am I working? I have tools I like already, so what are their tools like? Can I use my tools? What else is around there for developers? What tooling is in the platform? And then again, how flexible is the platform? Do I have choice, or am I in a very restricted environment? And you have to consider these things with each different kind of platform. So when you open up a Wix site, you're going to see, obviously, the visual editor, but off to the side, you're going to see a code editor as well. So you open this up, and it's like an in-editor page code editor, but this doesn't look like a very fun place for a developer to work, right? It's small. It's not really meant for much. It's meant for really small client-side code. You're probably not going to work here. There's a GitHub integration. That might be where you work if you want to use kind of the IDE of your choice, or if you like to host your code locally, you can push via a CLI. So you have an option there. That's good to know. Or there's another IDE that is based on VS Code. It's the Wix IDE, and then that opens in a separate window, and then you get VS Code. So for me, that'd be perfect. I'm like, VS Code's what I generally work in when I work outside of the Wix environment. So for me, this would be a good thing. Maybe not for everybody, but it's good to see this. And then you also, once you start writing some code in it, you'll see it's based on JavaScript. There are going to be some things you have to learn about how to extend Wix apps. So there's some things that are a little proprietary, but if you've been working in JavaScript, they're easy to pick up. And if they're not, Wix also has an AI assistant embedded into the developer environment that's trained on the documentation and is able to generate code for you or help fix the code if it's something Wix specific that you're working with, and you don't want to have to go outside of the system to Google around and dig through the docs to try to figure out what it is that you're not understanding. So once you've assessed the dev environment, you know what language you're working in, you know what's available to you, then you might go back and say, well, what else is there? And you may not need it now, but it's good to know, again, always be future thinking with low code, because you want to know where you're going to run into walls. So you know that you need to set up a little bit of data for the folks to be able to have their banner. There's an included database. As a developer, you would want to know how that database is connected. It's built on top of Mongo for Wix. That may be something that you're interested in, that you like working with, it'll inform how you want to structure your data, not necessarily for a client like a restaurant. There's probably not a whole lot of data needs they have for you. But if this was a larger project, it might be very important to you to pick your database. And then you'd also see that I can connect an external database. In the case of Wix, you can connect any external database that you would want if you don't want to use the included one. Another thing you would want to know is, we talked about node modules earlier. Can you install the different helper tools that you like? For example, if you're a TypeScript dev, we don't support TypeScript out of the box right now, and that might be completely unacceptable for you, but you might be okay with importing JSDoc so that you can still have that type safety. So you want to know that you can import things and tools that you're used to using, and that's something that's going to make your dev life a much more enjoyable experience. Other considerations, look at the security. Is there an available product roadmap? Are you looking at a product now that seems to be being worked on, or one that seems to be sunsetting? You don't want to latch onto a product or a tool is kind of dying, right? So you want to make sure that it's going to be good. What's the learning curve for non-technical users? If it's really hard for the non-technical users to learn it, it's going to come back to you, and then you're going to be potentially working in an environment that you don't enjoy. So you want to make sure that there's a lot of information out there for your non-technical users on your team or your clients if they're using it. What's the infrastructure behind it? And then this is something to think about up front, is if you ever need to get away from it, how do you retire it? So for Wix, you can export all your code, you can export all your data, but the UI right now is a drag and drop editor. You don't have access to the code other than your CSS. So that's something to keep in mind. There is the headless option, so you could keep the business solutions and then pop off and do whatever front end you want. But it is something to think about. Here's the parts I can get out of the system and then work on a migration. Here's the parts I would have to start over with nothing. So some takeaways. Low code does not necessarily mean low engineering. Defining your requirements clearly, I think, is important with anything we're building. But in the case of low code, you're assessing trade-offs and potentially hard lines in the sand where you can't go anywhere, and then you would have to change your tool. So really clear requirements are very important when assessing low code. The role of the developer is to be early in the conversation, guiding, automating, analyzing, enabling that collaboration, providing the understanding of what the underlying technical structure of this platform is that you're using, so that you can inform the less technical users on your team, the business users on your team that want that velocity and want that money savings, and be able to tell them if they're really going to get it or not. Low code is about abstraction and empowerment. You do want to empower the non-technical users on your team, mostly to do things that you probably don't want to do anyway, so that you can focus your energy on building and creating, like in whatever the language of your choice is, whatever your preferred stack, whatever the preferred problems are that you want to solve. So that's my journey with low code. Thank you all for joining me so much. This has been a pleasure. And if you have any other questions, I love to talk about this and open source and anything else. And it's been really wonderful to be here.